Why does public housing seem to be failing in the United States? Now, history is littered with ideas that on paper appear to be brilliant, but when put into practice, the results ended in disaster. And the story of public housing in America may be one of the clearest examples of how good intentions don't always lead to positive results. It wasn't until after World War II that the federal government began to pour billions of dollars into public housing projects in cities like Chicago, New York, and St. Louis. At the time, many of these cities were engaged in other urban renewal projects that involved building massive highways, clearing slums, and demolishing old neighborhoods that had been left largely untouched since the turn of the century. And what happened next was a disaster. Despite intending to replace the urban slums that had been destroyed a decade earlier, almost all of these public housing projects ended up becoming slums of their own. In some cases, the situation was even worse than before. The elevators and plumbing broke down and were never repaired. Vandals trashed apartment complexes before families could even move in. Crime spiraled out of control. Drug dealing, robbery, and in some cases even rape and murder were rampant. Many of these crimes weren't even committed by the residents themselves, but rather by transients preying on low-income families. The architect of St. Louis's Puritt-Igoe projects, who would go on to later design the World Trade Center, lamented that he never thought people were that destructive. Within just a few years, the vacancy rate soared. In 1972, Puritt-Igoe was demolished less than 20 years after first opening its doors. A similar story played out at Cabrini-Green in Chicago, which would also go on to be demolished in the late 1990s and early 2000s. So what happened? Why did these projects fail? Now, many reasons have been proposed over the years, and all of them certainly played some role in the failure of public housing in the United States. But the biggest problem facing the projects might not be crime or even a lack of funding, but rather a silent problem that has plagued virtually all public housing projects around the world. Economists call it the tragedy of the commons. So, what is that? Well, it's an observation of what happens when a property is not actually owned by the people who are using it. You see, there is a natural incentive to properly protect, maintain, and even improve things that you own. But when you are given access to property for which you have few, if any, responsibilities, and no ability to profit from or accumulate wealth in, well, the incentive structure changes. It no longer makes a great deal of economic sense for you to spend scarce resources improving something that isn't yours. Not to mention that when you are told that you have a basic human right to this property, it creates a sense of entitlement, that if something does go wrong, well, that's the responsibility of someone else to fix it. Now, add to all of that the fact that such housing units are usually managed in some capacity by a combination of local, state, and federal guidelines. They're unprofitable and they're prone to corrupt practices and waste, and you have a textbook exercise in the tragedy of the commons. Perhaps worst of all is that despite this knowledge, the answer provided to solve the problem is always more government spending instead of thinking of ways to genuinely help people achieve true ownership.